In this video, I wanted just to give you a guided tour of the labjack device, these red boxes we have around the lab, and what they're used for. So the first thing you notice about the labjack device is that it's a USB device. If you look carefully at it here, there's a USB connector right here, which we have a USB cable plugged into, and it goes to the other end, a USB slot here, which you can plug into a computer. So for some odd reason, this red box can be plugged into the USB port on a computer. But here's what it does. It's not a digital camera, it's not a video camera, it's not something like that. But if you look at the front of it here, it has all kinds of hookup wire opportunities on it here. Let me get this out of the way and I'll explain what that is in a minute, but just a quick tour of it right here. What you see on the labjack, there's a bunch of jacks labeled AI0, AI1, ground, AI2, AI3, and so on. AI stands for analog input. So this means analog input 0, analog input 1, and you see that there's 7 of these channels right here. So what that means that the labjack does, at least on this face right here, is it allows you to take in up to 8 channels of analog input type signals. Now when you hear the word analog in electronics, you're definitely thinking of a signal that may be something like a sine wave or a varying signal. It's an analog thing, so it's not digital, just 0 or 5 volts, true or false or binary. It's an analog signal. In the case of the labjack here, these analog signals can be anything between plus and minus 10 volts. So in other words, you can send in anything between plus and minus 10 volts on these analog inputs here, and of course that's all relative to these pins here, which are labeled ground. So you always have to send them in relative to ground, but that's what the labjack is for. If you look at further inspection of the labjack here, you see there's some power on here. There's plus 5 volts and plus 5 volts. These aren't very strong power supplies, meaning they can't supply a lot of current because they're coming right from the USB bus and the labjack themselves, but they'll give you a few tens of milliamps if you just wanted to power something, maybe even a digital integrated circuit if you're lucky. But there is a voltage reference on these things, and yes, these voltage references can be routed right into an analog input for some testing. If you sort of keep looking then, you also see some things like this here. You see IO0, IO1, IO2, IO3. These are just input outputs again, and these are going to be your digital ones over here. So the digital ones refer now to signals that are plus or minus 0 and 5 volts. That's what these are going to be for right here. So these are some digital inputs, and you see there's 4 of those. So you have 4 digital inputs. So again, the power of the labjack. 8 analog input channels, 4 digital input channels, and if I continue on then, and I guess I should also emphasize that on these digital channels here, they can be configured as either input or output. That's what IO stands for, so input or output, digital in this case here. So they can actually read if a value is 0 or 5 volts or send out 0 or 5 volts depending on what you want to do. There's some more ground terminals over here, and then if I look again here, I see some other ones labeled AO0 and AO1. These are analog outputs. So these are going to be sort of the complements of what these do, where these are analog inputs, these are analog outputs. So these things allow you to send a voltage out to the circuit or the real world that you happen to be working in here. There's a few others in here. There's a ground and there's a counter on here. This actually will count digital pulses that are going in here, and there's a few other things which you can investigate yourself. But I think for this particular class in this lab here, the analog inputs, the digital inputs and outputs, and the analog outputs are going to be the important ones from us. So what we have sort of wired in here, which will be seed some of the LabVIEW demonstration videos, which you can also watch here, is just a good old 3-wire potentiometer here. So if you look at the way it's wired up here, I have one extreme side of the potentiometer screwed right into the 5-volt terminal. The other extreme side of the potentiometer on this green cable here going into ground. So I have the fixed ends or the extreme leads of the potentiometer between plus or minus 5 volts. The middle one, or the wiper, say the variable part of the potentiometer on this wire right here, is going right into analog input 0. So as I turn this potentiometer right here, the voltage on this middle wiper, which is going into analog input 0, is going to vary between 0 and 5 volts. That's my supply voltage right here. So by wiring it this way, I have just an awesome simple test case for working with LabVIEW and interfacing with labjack with a pretty simple voltage input. So as I run the LabVIEW exercises that we're going to work on, to change this analog input here, I'm just going to turn this knob right here, which is going to vary the voltage on this middle wiper.